She laughed the first time she saw me. Not a polite dismissal, not the quiet, measured contempt of a commander who had decided to tolerate a political attachment. A real laugh, short and bright and aimed directly at me, with her pale gold eyes moving from my boots to the top of my head, and her mouth pulling at one corner the way a person's mouth does when something confirms exactly what they expected. "This," she said to her second in Velkorath, which she did not know I spoke, "is what the compact sends us." Her second, a tall woman named Dreth, with dark braided hair and a scar across her chin, looked at me the way you look at a piece of equipment that has been delivered to the wrong address. "He is very small," Dreth said. "He is very small," Sarath Velkorath agreed and turned away. I was 39 years old. I had spent 14 of those years on contested border assignments for the compact Frontier Ranger Corps, mostly in terrain that didn't have names yet and didn't want to give them to you. I was lean, not small lean, though I understood the distinction was not one anyone on that landing pad was interested in, and I had a scar on my right forearm from a hydraulic coupling failure on a survey barge 6 years back, and I carried a standard-issue compact field pack and a personal sidearm, and a short blade I had sharpened that morning, because I sharpened it every morning without exception. And I had learned early in my career that the state of your equipment tells you more about your relationship with contested terrain than any formal assessment ever will. I did not say anything. I picked up my pack, confirmed my assignment paperwork with the expedition's logistics officer, a quiet Velkorath man named Preen who looked at the ground when he spoke to me, which I took as a form of embarrassment on my behalf, and I found my designated position in the column, which was at the rear, and I started walking. The Velkorath Frontier Hunting Expedition, formerly the Velkorath Border Survey and Game Clearance Operation, Winter Rotation, was 14 personnel. Sarath Velkorath commanded it. She was 34 by compact standard reckoning, which meant she had been doing this for approximately as long as I had been doing my version of it, and she looked the way a person looks after 14 years of working in difficult terrain. Economical, deliberate, the kind of composed that doesn't waste energy on the unnecessary. Amber-brown skin, close-cropped silver hair with a single copper braid down the right side. She moved through the forest like someone who had grown up in it, which she had, and she gave orders with the specific efficiency of someone who had stopped needing to explain them a long time ago. The copper braid, Preen told me quietly on the second morning while we were checking equipment before the column moved, was a rank indicator. War Caste Commander, 3rd Ascendant. The braid was the designation. It meant she had led a unit in 3 confirmed engagements and been decorated in all of them. "She is very good at this," Preen said, in the tone of someone offering context they hoped was useful. "I believe it," I said. I meant it. I had been watching her manage the column for 2 days and she was excellent. The way she read terrain, scanning the canopy line, the route exposure on approaches, the sight lines between old growth and second growth without ever appearing to pause, was the work of someone who had internalized the geometry of difficult country so thoroughly that it was no longer a conscious process. She saw the landscape the way I saw it, and I had spent 14 years learning to see it that way. The problem was that she saw it entirely from the west. The terrain we were working was a 3-day transit east to west across the Velkorath border ridge system, dense mixed canopy, deep ravine country, the kind of place where the trees were old enough that their root systems had reorganized the ground into ridges and hollows that didn't match any map made within the last 20 years. The compact had a treaty interest in the survey data. The Velkorath had a treaty interest in the game clearance. The operation served both, and neither side trusted the other enough to do it separately, which was why I was here. I understood my function. I was a walking statement of compact oversight. I was not expected to contribute. I was expected to observe, stay out of the way, and file an accurate report. I intended to do all 3. On the 3rd morning, Sareth gave the column a new bearing that took us off the prepared route. I checked my survey maps and noted that the new bearing ran us along the top of the primary ridge system, better sight lines, faster transit, but exposed to the ravine approach from the east. The western approaches to the ridge were covered by the natural terrain feature of a long scarp face. Nothing came at the column from the west without significant effort and noise. The eastern side was different. The ravine system on the eastern slope was navigable, and it ran upward toward the ridge crest at a grade that a coordinated group of experienced terrain workers could cover quietly in the pre-dawn hours. I walked up to Preen. "Tell the commander that the eastern ravine approach on the ridge line is open," I said. "No natural cover between the third growth break and the drop. Anyone working that approach from the Velrikar side would have a clean line on the column for a quarter-kilometer." Preen looked at the ground. "The commander has reviewed the route," he said. "I'm sure she has. Tell her anyway." Preen told her. Sareth listened without turning around. Then she said something in Velkorath that I didn't catch all of. She spoke quickly when she didn't want me to follow it, but I caught the end, which was the word for sparrow, used in a specific context that meant something like the small nervous bird that sees danger in everything. Dreth made a sound that was not quite a laugh but occupied the same territory. The unit moved in the new bearing. I moved with it. I adjusted my position in the column from the rear to a flanking position about 20 meters east, where I could watch the ravine approach without advertising that I was watching it. The tree cover on the eastern shoulder was thin enough that I could see the upper portion of the ravine system, the third growth break, the angled slope above it, the way the light came through differently in the open section, and thick enough that I was not a visible silhouette from below. I started running the geometry that afternoon. Not on paper. In my head, which was where I had always done this kind of work. The way the shelf at the top of the ravine approach was the only viable exit point onto the ridge crest in this section. The 4-meter width of it between the two old root formations that flanked it on either side. The left formation's angle that would push anyone coming up the left edge of the approach into a predictable line. The sight line from the eastern edge of the shelf down into the ravine. The footing, slick near the center from the accumulated moisture of the canopy, better traction on the outer edges. I calculated the time to hold the shelf against a coordinated approach. 11 minutes approximately if I was efficient and the terrain worked with me and I didn't make serious mistakes. 11 minutes against a professionally trained group of 9 or fewer. More than 9, and the math changed. Dreth noticed on the second hour of the afternoon watch that I was in a flanking position rather than the rear. She dropped back beside me. "You don't need to do that," she said. Her compact standard was good, clipped, and precise. The way someone speaks when they learned a language from technical documentation rather than conversation. "I know," I said. "The commander doesn't want you to do that." "I know that too." Dreth looked at me for a moment with an expression I recognized. The recalibration expression. The one that appears on a person's face when something is behaving differently than the category they'd put it in. I have seen it on a lot of faces in 14 years of border assignments. It is always the expression that precedes the more interesting part of the conversation. She went back to her position. She didn't tell Sareth. That was the afternoon of the third day. The morning of the fourth day, the Velrikar hunters arrived. There were 9 of them. I was awake before dawn because I had been awake at dawn every day of this expedition. Old habit, bad terrain, the kind of instinct that becomes involuntary after enough time in contested country. I had my survey scanner in hand and my position on the eastern shoulder, which was not where I'd been assigned to sleep, and was about 40 meters from where the rest of the unit had their camp set up in the hollow below the ridge crest. I saw the heat signatures first. Not clearly. The canopy was thick enough that the thermal reading off my survey scanner was ambiguous, broken up by the interference of the root mass, and the residual warmth of the soil from the previous day. But there were enough of them, spaced at the intervals of a coordinated hunting formation rather than the organic scatter of game animals, and they were moving up the ravine at a pace that said they had been moving through the night or close to it. Experienced people who knew this terrain, which meant they had been planning this approach for longer than the current expedition's duration. I counted 9 heat signatures. The count was as consistent as the equipment could make it. I ran the math. Our column was 14, but we had been camping, which meant personnel scattered between sleeping positions and watch rotations, not staged for rapid response. Sarath's camp was in the hollow below the ridge crest, good cover from the west, which was where she'd expected any approach to come from, because the western scarp face was the obvious approach vector, and she had oriented the camp's defensive geometry accordingly. The eastern shoulder, the ravine approach, the open section of third growth and the shelf, all of that was behind her position, behind and above, and if the 9 hunters reached the ridge crest before the column was organized, they would have the high ground over the camp with clear lines to the hollow. I thought about going back to wake the unit. I calculated the time that would take. The distance back to the hollow, the time to raise and organize 14 people from sleeping positions, the time for them to move from the hollow to defensible positions on the ridge. I calculated the speed of the 9 signatures working up the ravine. I compared the 2 numbers. The comparison was not favorable. I had 3 things: my sidearm, my short blade, and the ridge. The shelf was the chokepoint. I had known it was the chokepoint since the previous afternoon. 4 meters wide, natural deflection on the left, sight line from the eastern edge. One person holding that shelf could slow a column of 9 considerably. Not indefinitely, not against 9 trained personnel who understood what they were doing, but slow them, disrupt their approach. Cost them time and coordination they had planned on not spending. I keyed my compact communicator on the low-frequency setting, short burst, 2 pulses, the compact ranger signal for contact imminent, organizing. The signal would reach the unit's equipment, and the equipment would wake whoever was on watch rotation. That gave the unit the alert. What it did not do was move them to the ridge in time to stop the 9 hunters before they reached the crest. That was the gap. I moved to the shelf. I want to be accurate about this, because I have told this story a few times in the years since, and the versions that circulate back to me have accumulated details I did not put there. I was not fearless. I was not eager. I looked at the shelf in the gray pre-dawn light with the old root formations dark on either side of it and the ravine opening below, and I ran the geometry one more time, the weight of it, the specific arithmetic of a person and a position, and a number of opponents and a required duration, and I decided it was the correct position to take, and then I took it. The fear was present the entire time as a practical input. It was not an impediment. It was telling me where to stand and when to move and when to be very still and what the sound of movement in the ravine below meant, specifically, and I used it the way I had been using it for 14 years, as information. The first 2 hunters came up together. They were good. They moved with the low center of gravity of people who had been working in ravine terrain for years, and they had short repeating bows strung and ready. And they were not surprised to find a person on the shelf because they had done their reconnaissance, and they knew the column had 14 members. A guard position on the ridge crest was a reasonable expectation. They came prepared for it. They were surprised to find only 1 person on the shelf. They expected a firing line, a position. What they found was a single human male standing on 4 meters of root-bounded shelf with a sidearm and a short blade in the gray pre-dawn light, and I watched both of them run the adjustment in approximately the same half-second, the same half-second in which I moved. I hit the first one with the sidearm before he completed the adjustment. The second one I took with the blade, which is a sentence that sounds more dramatic than the reality, which was that I moved left when he moved left, and the footing on the shelf's eastern edge was not what he expected. The terrain advantage I had built my entire calculation on, and he lost a step in the recovery, and I closed the distance while he was finding it. After that, the shelf was mine for about 40 seconds, long enough for me to re-establish my position on the eastern edge, the place where the sight line down into the ravine was clearest, long enough for the remaining 7 hunters in the ravine below to work out what they were looking at. The next 3 came up together, which was smarter. They used the width of the approach, spreading across all 4 meters, which was the correct response to a single defender on a chokepoint, forced the defender to manage multiple angles simultaneously. I managed it, not cleanly. The geometry got complicated in a way it had not been when I ran it in my head the previous afternoon, because real terrain at pre-dawn with real opponents is always more complicated than the calculation. But the left root formation did what I had calculated it would do, which was channel anyone coming up the left edge of the approach into a predictable line, and I used that channel, and the position held. I will not pretend I remember the next 9 minutes with complete clarity. What I remember is specific moments and the physical facts of the position. The way the shelf's surface was slick near the center from the previous night's canopy drip, the way I had to keep my weight back and to the right to maintain reliable footing on the eastern edge, the specific sound the left root formation made when something impacted it hard on the 3rd contact. I remember counting. Not the hunters counting breaths, which is a habit from extended positions in contested terrain that regulates the tendency toward urgency when urgency will cost you your footing, and your footing will cost you everything else. The 3rd and 4th hunters came up together and split, one to the left channel, one to the right. This was the smarter approach, and I had planned for it. The left channel pushed the left side hunter into the root formation's deflection arc exactly as I had calculated. The right side hunter was mine to manage on the eastern edge, and I managed it, but the exchange cost me time, and I was aware of the time, because the time was the variable everything else depended on. The 5th hunter came alone, which was unusual, and which told me something about the state of the coordination below. Individuals coming alone meant the formation had been disrupted, which meant they were improvising, which meant the coherent 9-person approach had fractured into something less organized. This was useful. Less organized is not the same as less dangerous. An improvising opponent in contested terrain is unpredictable in ways a coordinated one is not, but it changed the arithmetic. The 11-minute estimate had been built on a coordinated approach. A disrupted one might cost them more time than I had calculated. I adjusted for it and stayed on the shelf. I remember the communicator giving me 1 pulse back at approximately the 4-minute mark, then 2 pulses at approximately 7 minutes, which meant the unit had received the signal and was moving in coordinated sequence. I did not look toward the camp. The eastern approach was the relevant direction, and that was where I kept my attention. I remember getting hit. Left side, upper arm, a glancing contact from a blade rather than a clean cut, which was fortunate. The footing error on the eastern edge was mine, not my opponent's. I had been moving through a close exchange, and my left foot came forward a half-step further than I intended onto the slick center section, and I lost the grip I expected for approximately 1 full second, and in that second a blade found my arm. A clean cut would have been significantly worse. The glancing contact cut the skin and the layer beneath it and caught the edge of the old hydraulic coupling scar from 6 years back, which complicated things, but it was manageable and I managed it. The position did not move. The warmth of the cut registered across the next several seconds as information rather than signal to stop, and I adjusted my grip on the short blade to compensate for the change in the left arm, and I continued. The 6th and 7th hunters came up together at approximately the 9-minute mark, and by this point the approach had become something different than the organized assault it had started as. These two were moving with the careful, deliberate footing of people who had been watching the shelf from below for several minutes and had counted what was on it and had done their own arithmetic. They were not rushing. They were approaching with the measured pace of a decision that had been made. The decision that 9 was enough regardless of what was on the shelf, that the math would eventually resolve in their favor, that attrition would do the work. They were not wrong about the math. They were wrong about the timeline. I heard the Velkorath unit on the western approach to the ridge at the 10-minute mark. Not loudly. They were moving fast but moving well, which meant they were moving at the speed that experienced personnel use in heavy canopy when they need pace and cannot afford noise. But I knew their movement signature from 4 days of listening to it, and I knew it was them. The two hunters on the approach heard it at approximately the same moment I did. I watched the calculation happen in their posture, and their spacing, and the small adjustment in the angle of their approach that meant they were now considering a flanking unit, rather than only a single defender. 2 of the hunters from below began moving back down the ravine. The remaining 3 on the approach held. I held the shelf and waited for the math to finish. It finished the way contested terrain math usually finishes when the variables shift. The remaining hunters on the approach withdrew in good order, because that was the correct professional decision, and the shelf was mine, and the eastern ravine was quiet, and the morning was several minutes old. I remember the moment I heard the Velkorath unit moving up the ridge from below. Not because it changed anything I was doing. The position was the position, and I was still inside the math. But there is a specific quality of sound that a well-organized unit makes when it moves through heavy canopy at speed, and I had been listening to Sarath Velkorath's unit for 4 days, and I knew their movement signature. When I heard it coming up the western approach to the ridge, I knew it was them and not additional hunters, and I knew the math was about to shift. The hunters on the approach knew it too. I could see the calculation happening in the way they paused and adjusted. They had come up the ravine with 9. They now had considerably fewer than 9 functional, and they had a Velkorath combat unit organizing on their flank. The decision was professional and correct. 2 of them went back down the ravine. The rest held position and stopped advancing. I stood on the shelf in the early morning light with the cut on my arm and the short blade in my right hand, and watched the 3 remaining hunters on the approach do the arithmetic. Then one by one they withdrew. Not quickly. They backed down with the careful footing of people who had been in difficult terrain long enough to know that retreating in a hurry is how you leave your ground on your own terms versus someone else's. But they withdrew. The shelf was mine. I sat down on the root formation at the left edge, the one that had been doing most of the channeling work for the past 11 minutes, and I began working on the cut on my arm with the field kit from my pack. The kit was inside the front flap, which I could open one-handed if I was careful, and I was careful, and I was in the middle of the initial cleaning when I heard them coming up behind me. Sarath first. I recognized her movement from 4 days of watching it, the specific economy of her stride on uneven footing. Then Dreth. Then 3 others from the unit. I did not turn around. I kept working on the arm. "How many?" Sarath said. She was speaking compact standard, not the fast version. Clearly, precisely, with the careful articulation of someone making sure they were being understood. 9, I said. 2 withdrew when your unit reached the western approach. 7 are on the ravine floor. The ones who withdrew went down the eastern ravine system. They'll exit at the second growth break, approximately 2 kilometers south. They'll be running on foot from there. I recommend sending someone to report their egress route to the nearest compact post. A pause. You held this position alone. It was the correct position, I said. 4 meters wide, natural deflection on the left, sight line from the eastern edge. I calculated 11 minutes before the column would organize and arrive. The estimate was accurate. Another pause, longer than the first. "You're bleeding," Dreth said. Left arm glancing contact. I'm managing it. Let me. I looked up. Dreth was crouching beside me with her own field kit open, and her expression had moved somewhere past the recalibration look from the previous afternoon and into territory I recognized as something more significant. She took over the dressing with the efficient confidence of someone who had been doing field medicine in difficult conditions for years. Her work was cleaner than mine would have been, which I noted because it was relevant information. Sareth had not moved. She was standing at the center of the shelf, looking at the ravine approach and then at the root formations on either side and then at the space between them. Not at me, at the shelf itself, reading the geometry. I watched her do it. She was a war caste commander, third ascendant. She had led units in 3 confirmed engagements. She knew how to read terrain, and she was reading this particular piece of terrain with the focused attention of someone working out what it would have taken to hold it. The 4 meters, the left formation and its channeling angle, the eastern edge and the sight line, the center section and the footing problem on the slick surface. She turned and looked at me. The pale gold eyes were doing something different than they had done on the landing pad. On the landing pad, they had been making an assessment and arriving at a conclusion quickly and with confidence. Now they were looking at me, and then looking at the shelf, and then looking at me again, running a calculation that had not been part of their original framework and was not resolving quickly. And underneath the calculation, there was something I took a moment to identify. It was the look of a person who has made an accurate judgment about a category, based on all the information available to them, and has just been given information that the category was insufficient. It is not the same look as being wrong. Being wrong is simple. The information was bad and the conclusion was bad and you adjust. This was something more complicated. The information she had used to assess me on the landing pad had been accurate. I was lean, I was not the size of a Velkorath Ranger, and I had been sent by the compact. Every element of that assessment was factually correct. The category it assembled those facts into was the thing that had been insufficient. She knew it, I could see her knowing it. How long, she said. Approximately 11 minutes from first contact to your unit's arrival on the western approach. I had estimated 11 minutes when I took the position. The estimate was accurate to within 40 seconds. You estimated it. It was the relevant variable. If I couldn't hold long enough for your unit to organize and move, the position was pointless. I would have spent those minutes doing something else. So I calculated whether I could, and I concluded that yes, approximately, if I was efficient and the terrain cooperated. And if the terrain hadn't cooperated, then I would have adjusted. The eastern edge footing is better than the center, which I had identified. The left formation channels the approach, which I had identified. I had contingencies for the secondary approach 400 meters south. The footing there is worse and the line from the shelf is clear for approximately 3 steps. I was managing it. She held the eye contact for a long moment. Then she looked at Dreth. Dreth, who had finished the dressing and was now standing with her field kit closed, gave Sareth a small nod. Not an explanatory nod, a confirmatory one. The nod of a person who has already revised their position and is acknowledging that the revision is correct. Sareth said something in Velkorath then, quickly. Not the speed she used to exclude me, faster than that, the speed of something that is coming out before it is fully formed. I caught about half of it, enough to know it was not directed at Dreth, enough to know it was something she was working through rather than communicating, the kind of thing a person says when they are accounting for something to themselves. Then she said in compact standard deliberately, "Come down from the ridge when you're ready. I need your survey data on the eastern ravine approach, all of it." She turned and walked back toward camp. Dreth watched her go, then she looked at me. "You speak Velkorath," Dreth said. "Reasonably well," I said. 14 years of border assignments, you pick it up." "You understood what she said on the landing pad?" "Yes." And you said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. She was correct about what the compact sent. I am lean by Velkorath standards. The relevant question was whether that was functionally significant in the terrain we were working. The landing pad wasn't the place to make that argument. I looked at the shelf, at the root formations, at the ravine below. This was the place. Dreth was quiet for a moment. The forest was settling back into its ordinary sounds, the canopy shifting in the wind, something calling from the deep ravine below, the routine movements of the unit around the camp. The secondary approach, Dreth said. You said 400 meters south. Root exposure on the upper slope. Anyone ascending on that approach would lose half a step at the final turn before the ridge crest. Predictable line from the shelf's eastern edge. I had it in my sight line the whole time. You were managing 2 approaches. Monitoring 2, I had the shelf covered. The secondary was a contingency. No one used it. They were experienced enough to know the primary was the better choice, which also meant they were committed to the primary once they were on it. I paused. That was part of the calculation. Dreth almost smiled. A precise, controlled almost smile wore cast, which meant it was deployed carefully, but it was real and it was there. Come down, she said, and followed Sereth down the ridge. I sat on the root formation for a few more minutes. My arm was dressed correctly, and the morning light was coming through the canopy at a low angle that made the root formations look like architecture. The kind of old growth that has been in the same place long enough to become something more than trees. The ridge had been here longer than the expedition, longer than the Velkorath border system, longer than any of the treaty arrangements that had made me necessary as a walking statement of compact oversight on a survey operation in terrain with no names. I put my pack back on. The camp had already transitioned to operational status by the time I reached it. 3 personnel in elevated watch positions around the perimeter, gear staged, the watch rotation adjusted to account for the morning's event. Sereth ran a tight unit. She was at the survey table when I arrived, a flat section of root formation that Preen had identified and cleared on the first day, with maps weighted at the corners with field stones. She had retrieved my survey data from the shared archive without asking, which was also correct practice. I set my pack down and stood across the table from her. The ravine runs approximately 2.3 kilometers before it exits the ridge system to the east, I said. The viable approach to the ridge crest is the shelf we were just on. There is a secondary approach about 400 meters south, but the footing is worse, and the approach angle puts anyone ascending into a sight line from the primary shelf for approximately 3 steps at the critical point. A position on the shelf can address that approach simultaneously with the primary. I walked her through the full survey data. She asked good questions, technical, specific, the questions of a commander who understood that terrain was a variable and wanted to know all its values. Not the eastern approach only. The entire eastern slope, the ravine system from the second growth break upward, the alternative approaches, the weather impact on footing at different times of day. The kind of comprehensive situational mapping that I had been building in my head since the 3rd day. An hour of work. Preen took notes. Dreth stood at the table's eastern edge and occasionally added a detail from her own memory of the morning's positions. The shelf, Sereth said partway through. You identified it on the 3rd day. I began identifying it when you changed the route on the 3rd morning. I completed the geometric assessment that afternoon. You told Preen. I told Preen to tell you about the eastern approach. Yes. I called you a sparrow. I heard. She looked up from the maps. Her pale gold eyes held mine with the same focus they had held the shelf geometry with, and this time, the thing running underneath the assessment was no longer the recalculation in progress. The recalculation was finished. You weren't angry, she said. No. You understood what I said. I understood why you said it. You assessed what the compact sent and arrived at a reasonable conclusion based on available information. The assessment was accurate as far as it went. It didn't go far enough, but that's a condition of available information, not a failing of the assessment. There was no way for you to know what you didn't know. She was quiet for a moment. The expedition moved around us in its quiet operational rhythm. And you went to the shelf anyway, she said. The shelf was the correct position. Your assessment of my size didn't change the geometry. The geometry is the geometry. Something shifted in her face then. Not a dramatic shift. Sarath Velkorath was not a person who did dramatic shifts. But it was real, and it moved across her features with the quality of a change in light. Not sudden, but definitive. The kind of change that does not move back. She called Dreth's name. Dreth was at her side within moments. Then two others from the unit. A tall, quiet man named Veth who had been in watch position on the northern perimeter, and a younger woman whose name I had not yet learned, who had the specific look of someone in her first or second expedition, and was trying to calibrate what she was witnessing. They arranged themselves with the spatial awareness of a unit that recognized a formal address was coming, and I watched them find their positions, and I understood what was about to happen approximately 2 seconds before it happened. Sarath straightened to her full height. In Velkorath, there is a form of address called the Velkoratharath, the battle naming, the practice of placing a person's name in the Warcast record alongside an act the Warcast considers worthy of permanent acknowledgement. It is not a title, it is not a rank promotion. It is a specific form, structured, precise, with particular elements that must be present in a particular order, spoken aloud before witnesses by the commander who witnessed the act, and once it is spoken and received it enters the record and remains there. I had read about it in compact intelligence documentation on Velkorath customs and traditions. I had read it with the same flat professional attention I gave to terrain surveys and treaty provisions. I had not expected to encounter it. Sarath Velkorath, Warcast Commander 3rd Ascendant, standing at a survey table in a ridge country camp with her copper braid catching the morning light filtering through the canopy, looked at me with eyes that had finished running their calculation, and she spoke the Velkoratharath. I will not reproduce it in its formal Velkorath. The form has a weight in their tradition that I am not qualified to carry in translation, and the naming belongs to the record where it was placed, not to my account of it. What it said, in substance, she named the shelf. She named the 4 meters and the route formations and the sight line. She named the 11 minutes. She named the act of taking the position before dawn when no one had asked and no one was watching and the math said it would be close. She named the cut on my arm and the fact that the position had held regardless. She named my name, Kale Dross, Compact Frontier Ranger, 14 years in contested border terrain, and placed it in the Velkorath Warcast record alongside all of those things, and she said that the record would hold it. Then she said the Velkorath battle name she was giving me. I will not reproduce that either, but the word she used, translated, the word for the quality of a small, fast predator that holds ground it has no business holding, not through strength, not through size, through understanding the terrain better than what comes against it, and using the gap between those two things with absolute precision. There is an animal in the Velkorath Highlands. I learned this from Preen that evening, roughly half the size of anything it could reasonably challenge, known throughout the ridge system for its habit of holding its territory against considerably larger opponents. It chooses its ground carefully. It understands the geometry of where it stands. It uses the fear as information. The Velkorath call it Velkorathshen, the ground holder, the one who knows where to stand. She gave me that name. The unit was very quiet. Dreth had her arms at her sides with the precise stillness of formal attention. Veth was looking at the tree line in the way someone looks at something when they are feeling an emotion they are not certain how to position. The younger woman was looking at me with wide eyes, and the expression of someone storing an event for later examination. Sarath waited. I said in Velkorath, not perfect Velkorath, the Velkorath of a person who learned it from border assignments and documentation rather than childhood, but accurate because I had read the documentation carefully. I receive it. I stand as I am. The formal Velkorath reception of the Velkorath. You are not supposed to know it unless you have spent significant time with their customs, and I had spent significant time with their customs, because 14 years in contested border terrain has taught me that understanding the people you work alongside is a form of the same geometry as understanding the shelf. Both of them are about knowing where you actually are. Sarath held eye contact with me for a long moment. Then the composed war caste expression did something I had not seen it do before. It settled. Not opened, that is not the right word for it, and I have thought about the right word a number of times since. Settled is closer. The way terrain settles after an event, into the configuration it will hold going forward. The recalculation was complete. The new information had been integrated. The revised assessment was accurate and she was at peace with it. Your survey data on the eastern approach will be included in the Velkorath expedition record, she said. Your contribution to the route assessment will be noted. Understood, I said. And the Velkorath, she said. It has been given 312 times to Velkorath speakers. I understand it is unusual, I said. It has never been given to a non-Velkorath speaker, she said. Her voice was even and precise. In 312 instances in the record's history, it has not been given to someone outside the war caste. I did not say anything. The record will note that as well, she said. And then, in a tone that had no contempt in it and no category assessment, and no assumption about what the compact sent, just the even acknowledgement of one person to another who had been somewhere they both knew the weight of. You may return to the survey table. We have 3 more days of terrain to cover. I returned to the survey table. We worked through the remaining data. At one point Sarath asked me, without looking up from the maps, the two who withdrew, you said they exited south along the ravine system. Approximately 2 kilometers south, I said. The second growth break is the closest viable exit. On foot from there they'd be moving through open terrain, visible from the ridge for the first quarter kilometer. I'd recommend relaying their egress bearing to the nearest compact monitoring post. Not because they'll come back today. Because the Velrakar will want to know their approach failed and they'll want to know why. And the answer to that question will inform whether they try the same approach again. Sarath looked up. You're thinking about the next expedition, she said. I'm thinking about what the Velrakar learned from today and what they do with it, I said. That's also part of the job. She was quiet for a moment. Then she made a notation on the map margin, a short precise mark in the Velkorath survey shorthand I had been reading over her shoulder for 4 days, and returned to the main survey. Noted, she said. That evening, around the expedition's field fire, Preen sat beside me and talked. He told me about the Velkorathshen, the highland animal, its territory habits, the way it chose its ground, the way it understood the geometry of where it stood better than anything that came against it. He spoke quietly, with the manner of a person sharing something that mattered to him, and I listened with full attention. Both assessments, Preen said after a while. The one from the landing pad and the one from this morning, both of them will be in the expedition record. I know, I said, she told me. You understand why. The record is the record. You don't edit it because it's unflattering to the editor. You add to it when the information changes. Preen looked at me with an expression that was gentle and direct at the same time. Yes, he said, that is what she believes. Across the fire, Sarath was working through the debrief with Dreth and Veth, the morning's positions, the response timing, the contingencies that had and hadn't been needed. Her copper braid caught the firelight. Her pale gold eyes were focused with the particular quality of a good commander doing a thorough professional accounting. She looked across the fire at me once. Not the landing pad look, not even the ridge look, something that had landed on the other side of both of those and was simply there, clear and settled, without anything unresolved in it. I nodded once. She nodded once. That was all. The remaining 3 days of the expedition were good work. We completed the survey, the game clearance, the route documentation. Sarath included my data. I maintained the flanking position on the eastern shoulder, which no one asked me to do and no one asked me to stop doing. The younger woman, whose name I learned was Veen, second posting, strong situational awareness, started checking in with me during the afternoon watches to compare sight lines. She did not ask permission to do this. She simply appeared at my flanking position on the afternoon of the 5th day and said, in careful compact standard, "What are you watching?" "Eastern canopy line," I said. "Sight line variation between the second growth sections. Wind direction this afternoon is shifting, changes the sound transmission from the ravine system below." She absorbed this and started watching the same thing. On the last morning, before the transit shuttle arrived, Dreth found me at the edge of the landing clearing checking my pack. "The Velkorath Shen," she said. "The animal. Preen told me about it. It does not hold its territory because it is not afraid," she said. "It holds its territory because it understands the territory better than what comes against it. The fear is present the entire time. It uses the fear." "I know," I said. "That's the job." Dreth nodded once. "Yes," she said, "that is the job." The shuttle came in at the 8th hour. I loaded my pack and took my assigned seat and watched the ridge country drop away below the viewport as we lifted. The eastern ravine system was visible from altitude, the dark line of it running up toward the ridge crest, the shelf invisible from this angle, but there, in the geometry of the landscape, exactly where I had placed it in my head 3 days before I needed it. Sarath was in the forward section of the shuttle, working on the expedition documentation. She had a stylus and a flat data pad and the focused efficiency of a commander doing a familiar task correctly. She would be writing both assessments into the record, the landing pad 1 and the ridge 1. Both of them, in the correct order, accurately reported. She looked up once and met my eyes across the shuttle cabin. Then she went back to the documentation. "I have filed a lot of reports in 14 years of border assignments. The report I filed on the Velkorath border survey and game clearance operation, winter rotation, is the most precise one I have written. Every measurement, every approach angle, every variable I had identified in the eastern ravine system from the 3rd day onward, all of it in the correct sequence. The compact archive has it. The Velkorath expedition record has it alongside the Velkorath Arith. The ground holder, the one who knows where to stand. I had 14 years of contested border terrain. I had a scar on my right forearm from a hydraulic coupling failure and a new dressing on my left arm from a morning on a 4-meter shelf. I was lean, and the geometry didn't care about that, and I had always known the geometry didn't care about that. And on the 4th morning of the Velkorath border survey and game clearance operation, winter rotation, so did Sarath Velkorath. The record would hold it, both of them. It was enough. It was exactly enough.